Sorry for closing. Good afternoon, everybody. Some of you may have been surprised that last time in the first lecture I talked a lot about millions of years ago, the evolution of the human race, so to say, and the development of culture beginning 10,000 years ago. The reason is that social scientists usually don't hear a lot about this, and also they are not extremely interested in that because that's the dirty biological heritage that we get from evolution. And isn't it the case that everything we do is primarily socially influenced? Well, I'm not convinced of that, of the exclusivity of social influences. There is a lot of other influences that play a role. And I want just to wrap up and finish the last lecture with this picture that was produced 4,500 years ago before present. And it shows cows, obviously, and it also shows the importance, obviously, that cattle economy played for Egypt during those times. And this particular cattle economy had a strong influence on our genetic outfit. I don't know how many of you do have lactose intolerance. Is there anybody? One person among the whole group? That's not too many. So most of us have had a genetic change during the last 8,000 to 10,000 years. That was introduced, that came about as a consequence of culture. Because it was a big advantage if somebody living in a cattle culture was able to digest milk and milk products beyond the age of the baby. So as babies, every human baby, of course, is able to digest lactose in order to digest mother milk. But later, we lose this ability, at least before the existence of cattle culture existed. We lost the ability to digest milk and milk products and yogurt and cheese and everything. But it was a big genetic advantage if we maintained the ability to digest milk products. So this advantage was expressed in terms of a higher fitness of those people who had this genetic advantage in comparison to those who did not have this. And this led to the dominant fact in Europe and other cultures that derived from cattle cultivating, that we all are able to digest lactose. And the few cases who are not able to digest lactose, who get sick and diarrhea from eating milk products, are the remnants, so to say, the remaining people that lack this genetic outfit. Another consequence of the last 10,000 years is something. Sorry, there is something missing here. Is colonialism. What is colonialism? If we want to explain colonialism, we would say, there are the bloodthirsty European colonizing imperialist countries like Great Britain, like Holland, like France, etc., who subjugated those tribes and people from other continents who were living peacefully in their villages. And this fact of colonialism actually is only half of the story. Actually, we must ask, how is it possible that one part of the globe had the opportunity to develop in a technological way that was far beyond the technological achievements of other cultures? And the answer actually is in the story that I tried to tell last time. Can anybody imagine what the advantage of the Europeans was with regard to technological development?
East-West.
The East-West axis of the Eurasian continent, yes. And related to that, the proximity to the cradle of agriculture and the cradle of settlements and the cradle of writing cultures and things like that. So all this gave a big advantage to those cultures that were able to exploit the inventions that were made 10,000 years ago in the golden area of in the golden crescent of the Near East. Without that, we would not have had such a strong technological advancement compared to people on other continents. And I think in the last 10,000 years, there is also the secret hidden to some part for understanding our concept of family. What is our family? Can you tell me? Consists of what?
Those people who we think of.
Who?
Those people who we think that are families.
Like, for example?
Like parents and child.
Parents. Parents is a plural. Who is parent?
Sorry?
What do you mean by parent? Mother and father, I assume? Yes. Okay. But this only exists since 10,000 years ago. Before, there were only mothers, of course, because the way of relating between men and women, or boys and girls, in the very early societies, as we can judge from the sexual dimorphism between our sexes, where the women or the females are largely in the average, a little bit smaller than the boys and the men, show a certain sexual relationship pattern. That means that groups of males and groups of females related to each other in a very promiscuous way. So that the role of the mother always was clear, but the role of the father was never clear. Only through the development of culture for 10,000 years ago, it became possible, or it became necessary, due to a sedentary way of living that was made necessary by agriculture and by planting and by herding animals, to become aware of the role of fathering and the role of the father. So in a way, we must be aware of the fact that the role and the concept of father is not as old as the concept of mother. And these things are quite relevant in contemporary discourses, where many arguments in favor of or against the necessity of having two parents of different sex is being discussed, for example, in the political discourse about homosexual marriage and things like that. So anyway, knowing a little bit about the human cultural development allows us some insight some insight into contemporary topics. So let's just look quickly at timescales and the different frames of development that play a role in social psychology. There is one. Let's start from the bottom. First, of course, the evolutionary development, the evolution of mankind as a species. This is responsible, with its many million years of extension, is responsible for attributes that characterize mankind or people as members of the species of mankind. Of course, this includes also certain species, certain ways of cognitive functioning, of emotional functioning, of affective reacting, and of sexual behavior. Then we have the socio-cultural historical change. This is the realm of historians and other historically interested scientists who deal with time frames of decades to millennia in order to determine traits of certain cultures, of change, culture change, of how technology influences the structure and form of culture, etc., and the form of our social organization. Then comes the ontogenetic framework. That is the framework where our personal preferences are being imprinted on us, like the language we speak, that we learn automatically from the local speakers of our cultures, like in most cases the parents, and the wider social environment. Together with language, we attain culture, many pieces of culture, cultural behaviors, large cultural preferences, and above all, also taste. What tastes good and what does not taste good is attained in very early ontogenetic development. And of course, also in the puberty, sexual preferences are being learned from my closer proximal environment. The kind of selection choices that we make later in life have a strong determinant in the preferences or the patterns that we observe in our wider social family relationships and structure. Why is this so? Simply because a person growing up, being in puberty, which model does he or she have for a successful, biologically successful procreation? That's his or her parents. Of course, the parents are responsible for him or her to be here. That is, this couple had a certain success, procreational success, meaning that they as a couple were productive in the sense of creating fitness or making their genetic outfit fit in the sense of creating offspring. So every offspring member has a model in his or her parents that play a certain role in one's own preferences for sexual partners. So be it as it may, the last and most psychologically most analyzed level of development is the microgenetic change or microgenetic level, which is the here and now. That is processes that take from seconds to years, which mean the things are the changes that are implied by our everyday experiences, by what we learn, by what we study, etc., etc. So psychology is primarily concerned with microgenetic developments, and some of psychology also with ontogenetic stuff, and sociology and history with sociocultural change in the biology is concerned with phylogenetic developments. But this strict division, I think, in my opinion, is not very good, actually. But now let's come to the topic of beliefs, knowledge, and social representations within the lecture. Many of you may know that I have a seminar besides giving the lecture here. The seminar is on social representations. So in a way, we have a strong overlap between parts of the lecture and the seminar. I'm not sure I recognize all of you. Who has been in the seminar today? Some, not everybody, so about half. So I will need to repeat a little bit also about social representation. So let's talk about knowledge and opinions and beliefs. Opinions can be this or that. They can be knowledge or they can be belief. Belief versus knowledge often expresses certainty versus uncertainty. I mean, a belief is less certain than a knowledge, what we call knowledge usually, and it relates to existing and future events, maybe. For example, I know that yesterday there was a rain, and I believe tomorrow will be sunshine, would be a use of the terms knowledge and belief. Then, of course, we have the more important religious beliefs that are opposed to scientific knowledge. And we have in-group versus out-group relationships because, for example, we could think of a sentence of somebody, some person saying, they believe the earth is a globe, but we know it is flat. Huh? Meaning that we very often use the term belief to denigrate the opinions of others, of other groups, whereas we as an in-group know the things. So we know the earth is flat, but they think it is round. This characterizes more or less the wide realm, the wide circle of cognitive instances that can be called opinions, knowledge and belief. And within this realm there has been or is still a lot of infighting going on, as for example we can now witness in the religious struggles that exist in the Near East and probably very soon also in Europe. Let's look at knowledge philosophically. How can we define knowledge? Knowledge is defined by three elements. First, a subject. It can be said that a subject knows something, namely that P is the case. If and only if first P is true, the predicate, the subject believes also that P is true. Okay? And the subject has evidence for believing that P is the case. And this includes also that the belief P should not contradict other beliefs that or opinions that you hold in your brain, so to say. But immediately, if we look at this, the P, the predicate is true, the subject believes in the predicate, and the subject has evidence for that, creates a little problem for social scientists, because obviously points 1 and 3 are highly related. And it's obviously true that what can be mentioned, what can be said, what is true for our opinion or for our group is that which can be rationally justified. And we also know that, of course, so-called truths are historically relative, which always leads, or sometimes leads, to the tendency of people to say that there is no truth at all. So we must throw the concept of truth out of our vocabulary in any case. But let's look at this problem a little bit more in detail, so we will not throw out the baby with the bathwater. Knowing or throwing out the term of truth or the concept of truth, I think, is too early. Let's first look at what theories of truth we can quickly apply to a problem relevant in the social sciences, and then look at the problem of evidence. So the first theory of truth that we all of us believe in everyday life is the correspondence theory of truth. This postulates that I consider true what I perceive to be the case. I consider true that there is a table that I will hurt myself with if I walk against it. Okay? I believe this is true. I hope you believe that the chairs or the benches are true. Let's say true in the sense of supporting you. Otherwise you would need to sit like that, which is a good sport. So that's the everyday way of believing in the truth of our perceptions. And funny enough, in German language, the term perception means wahrnehmen, which in literal English translation would mean to take as true. Wahrnehmen, wahr from Wahrheit, truth, and to take it as truth means then the whole concept of perception. So it postulates that there is a correspondence between that P is the case and some other outside fact in the world. And this correspondence probably has the problem that the question of a relationship between some fact outside and my belief in that something is the case needs a methodology. Even if I look at something, my visual impression is determined by the structure of the eye, by the anatomical and physiological structure of the eye. So there is always a method involved, or let's say another precondition involved when we postulate a relationship between our beliefs and some fact outside. But usually it isn't a big problem in our everyday life, where we usually take for true what we can see and what we can hear. And as we all know, it is quite a good guide in everyday life to do this. It's not so much a good guide if we do science. The next useful theory of truth is the pragmatic theory of truth. What does it say? It says basically that what works well, what functions must be true, otherwise it wouldn't function. This is a good rule for people who do technology. But we also know that there are examples of things that work, that are made to work by some problem. Funny enough, astrological horoscopes seem to work very well with believers in astrology, but they don't seem to work with non-believers in astrology. There was a series of psychological experiments on this. And I mean, it's not difficult to guess what is the reason for this difference, because whenever you know your horoscope for today, you're likely to follow the horoscope knowingly or not knowingly, and to more or less try to fulfill what the prognosis was, what it predicted, the horoscope for me. So whenever I believe in horoscopes, it works, and when I don't believe, it does not work. So there is a little problem with the pragmatic theory of truth. But in general, it makes a lot of sense in the technological realm, of course. Then we have the discursive theory of truth, which comes closer to a very useful theory developed by Habermas in a way that is very useful and helpful in social sciences. So what is socially true or discursively true is what we can tell others without, with some warranty. Warranty meaning that the other doesn't say, you're stupid, leave me alone, what you're telling is stupid. If he says, very interesting what you say here, then we have a warranted assertability. So, in a rational discourse, everything that is warranted assertable will be accepted because it is part of the local understandings of the local group within which the discourse is being developed. And of course, this implies a group relativity as well as cultural relativity, but it also defines and demarcates something that we can call a social rationality. So we have three theories of truth that have one thing in common. And this one thing in common is what? Is what the truth problem boils down to. The truth problem, if we look at it, boils down actually to the choice of evidence. What is a suitable evidence for what I consider as truth or as knowledge? So in a way, the problem of evidence is the common denominator of different theories of truth, meaning that what we define as evidence defines also what is acceptable as a truth theory. As John Elster, I'm not sure from which nationality he was, but probably from Scandinavian countries, said a very good sentence here: the substantive rationality of beliefs concerns the relationship between the belief and the available evidence, and not the relation between the belief and the world. So instead of talking about truth and defining theories of truth, it is good for us to think about evidence. That is what can serve for me to define knowledge, to justify knowledge at the end. So we are talking about forms of acceptable evidence, which are, of course, culturally and socially variable. Evidence can be many things, as we all know. It can be what my grandfather said. It can be what the priests say in religious countries. It can be what, if I'm an astrology believer, it can be what the stars say. It can be what the others say. If you have a tendency to follow what others say, or what's written in holy books, a term, effect of providing evidence that is relevant nowadays in our re-religious centuries. Or it can be what has been learned in school, or it can be what is being reported in media, or it could be what science reveals with its scientific methods and procedure. So as you see, depending on whether what we accept as evidence, depending on that, we will define our truth theory. So if I believe that my eyes will always tell me what is true, I will subscribe to the first theory of truth. The how was it called? The correspondent theory. Thank you very much. Correspondent theory of truth. If I believe in the workings of my technological developments, that this is a criterion, then I am subscribed to the pragmatic theory. And this creates also the big hiatus between religious beliefs and scientific knowledge. And here, by purpose, I use the differential concepts like belief and knowledge. And you will see why. What is the characteristic of religious or also totalitarian truth? This is the evidence that is provided by some holy book. Some holy book that is accessible only to the knowledgeable, to the priests who are able to interpret it. So this is mostly some millennia old. And the means of negotiation, the means of social argument are that we have no social argument. There is no rational discourse possible about it, not even in Christian churches. And usually religions try to establish some hermetic language that makes them immune to outside concepts. Years ago, I did a seminar on religion and psychology in Austria, and we invited a person from the Christian church, besides also later a person teaching Islam. But both had the tendency to really encapsulate themselves and their arguments within a hermetic language, meaning they use terms and reference to evidence coming out of personal experiences, of enlightenment, of feelings, etc., things that can never be reproduced in the sense of being controllable. But this has a consequence for religious beliefs. Religious beliefs are basically incorrigible. They cannot be corrected because evidence, for once and for all, has been written down in the holy books, and these holy books, of course, cannot be rewritten. They are there to be followed. So this is one pole of the big continuum between beliefs and knowledge. On the other hand, we have the scientific truth or scientific knowledge. This evidence that is considered acceptable, particularly in Western societies, is that we must consider as true and as knowledge what the scientific procedures reveal. And particularly those insights that science shows us that are the most recent insights. So there is a means of argument which is basically rational discourse, rational discussion, rational exchange of arguments, and providing evidence for a claim that we have. So there is, in contrast to religious beliefs, a rational discourse, which requires, of course, an open language that sometimes is being violated by, I dare to say, by some sociologist writers who, particularly when they are from a certain orientation, or maybe from France, who also like to be hermetic a little bit in their language, who violate the argument or the necessity of open language in science. But one important consequence for scientific knowledge is that it is corrigible. So we have the paradoxical situation that what we call a belief, which sounds like expressing insecurance, So not being sure about something. In the religious interpretation becomes the fixed and non-corrigible belief or opinion. Whereas what we call knowledge, which is provided by scientific evidence, becomes basically corrigible, can be corrected by providing new evidence and by rational discourse. You wanted to say something?
In the context of the last one, I was thinking that in the scientific truth evidence part, probably the more precise thing is like contemporarily accepted procedures and methodology should be added. Because, well, not any procedure, even the most Western one, will create something that we will acknowledge as knowledge. I don't
Right, I agree.
I would add there this contemporarily accepted, because I think it's essential.
That's why I said mostly recent.
Yeah, but still,
Think-
I mean, there can be procedures. I could be experimenting, I know, in bathroom with something, and I would call it procedure, but
Yeah.
if it's not accepted by the wider society,
True.
then you might come and say my procedure is completely wrong, and so whatever I come up with during the procedure is not knowledge, but just my beliefs.
Yeah. So there is, what you actually say is there is a kind of negotiation going on, even in science. And this is necessary, of course, and that is exactly what we call rational discourse. That we must calibrate our acceptance of what is an acceptable procedure. And these acceptable procedures, of course, change over time. And it's not only the contents being discovered by scientific insights, but it's also the way of how to arrive at new insights, where the methods become more and more complex, of course. If we think of Geneva, the CERN, the Centre de Recherche Nucléaire in Switzerland, with the big proton collider machine that they use there, is obviously a very modern way of gaining new insights into the structure of the universe. But few people in everyday life know or can understand, even to a marginal way, of how these machines work. So in a way, we have a development in science towards strong scientific specialist knowledge, of course. But within these specialist groups, we also maintain, and they will maintain, a rational discourse that allows to calibrate the insights in order to provide the general public with the presentation of the results of these insights. And these results, and we come back to this later, will be presented or will be developed as a social representation in the general public. But one thing we should remember as social scientists, us being social scientists, that there are two levels involved when we talk about means of evidence, means of providing evidence. This is first our level as researchers and as scientists who subscribe to a certain form of accepting evidence that can be presented and accepted in scientific papers, for example. And the object of our inquiries, the object of our research, that is the normal people, so to say, people on the street, their theory of truth or their belief in or acceptance of a certain evidence is a different level, is a different thing. Sometimes I have the feeling that social scientists forget that there is a difference between what we investigate about the man on the street and the woman on the street, and the evidence and rational discourse is going on within our community about our research. These are two things, okay? not the same thing. One example is for the psychologists among you. You probably have heard about Festinger's social comparison theory. Okay? Social comparison theory basically states, who is psychologist here? One? A few? Okay. You've heard about Festinger probably, and social comparison theory. He states three things. That first, that people desire to countercheck their opinions by validating them with whatever is available. But the preferable way of validating one's opinion is to check with the physical object. So, if I have the belief that fire is hot, the best way, according to Festinger, would be to light a fire, hold your finger in, and to see if it's hot or not. The second best way of getting evidence is to talk with somebody else, to compare yourself with others, or to talk with others and ask them what they think about your opinion. So what he's saying is, we in the West, or the people in general, as he says, have the tendency to believe what they can test on the physical object. And that's what they desire. And only if that doesn't work, if we don't have the physical object available, for example, they believe in a round earth that we cannot test ourselves, then we refer to others and ask them for their opinion. And by doing this, we compare our opinion with other opinions. But what is Festinger actually saying with his theory? What is he actually saying? In his second postulate here, he's actually saying that what is locally acceptable in the West, that is in the US culture where he was teaching, there it is true that people want to check it maybe on the physical object. Because the West has in the last centuries has made the West very, very sympathetic to science and to the methods of science in order to talk about things and to discover new insights and to leave religion besides. So what he actually shows us with his second postulate is what is preferred in his culture. He doesn't tell us what is preferred in a remote Asian culture, for example, where somebody may still value asking a priest more than looking at the object itself. So what this theory is not a general theory, it's not applicable to many other cultures, but is a theory that tells us more about the local culture where Festinger and the local society where Festinger was working than about other cultures. Okay, talking about knowledge, we should also talk about reason. So what is the usual definition of what is reasonable? Reasonable is everything that is logically consistent. Beliefs that are logically consistent, that do not contradict each other. So one could say that a possible world in which all clauses are true, that is, where no contradictions can be derived from them, is a reasonable world. So the criterion is the internal contradiction, freedom of contradiction. This also applies to economic rationality. For example, if I believe that my personal income or well-being or profit is bigger doing that than doing that, I should do that because it maximizes my well-being and my profits and my money and everything, being the economic measure of success. So in a way, reason in the structural definition is providing consistency. So mathematically, actually, we do not want that the P and its complement is at the same time true. Okay? We do not want that P and not P is true at the same time. But there is a counterexample. Foucault mentions in one of his books the example of the men of glass. If I believe I'm of glass, okay, I'm well advised to move very carefully, not to touch this hard desk here, because if I do, I will shatter. My glass will break. So this person who believes he's of glass and takes care of not touching any hard object is a very rational person, in a way, isn't he? Because he's acting rational. Rationally, he's acting rationally in the sense of not trying to break his constituency of being of glass. So in a way, he's observing the structural criterion of consistency. What is wrong with this person is, of course, the content of his belief. But structurally, he's rational. So actually, if we look at reason, we also must look at the content of reason, meaning contentful definition of reason. We know in everyday life, and we know also in our scientific way of thinking, that the content also plays a big role in what we accept and what we don't accept. For example, take the opinion or the belief that the countries of Austria and Hungary were once united in an empire. That's the belief P. Or they were not. That's the belief not P. These two things, if we ask somebody to answer this question, then he or she will say, okay, according to my historical knowledge, they were once united in an empire. So the person can decide between P or not P being true. Can decide about the empire idea being true or not true. And this is a sensible and acceptable content in Middle European culture to ask or to think that way. It is a comprehensible statement. The same structure obviously can be applied to something that is obviously irrational. So if I say that Sylvia is the seventh reincarnation of the sacred dog, or she's not, and if you are asked to answer, is it true or not true? We are facing the same logical structure, P or not P, to select between the two. Only one of the two can be true. But still we have a problem to decide. Why do we have a problem to decide? Despite the logical equivalence of the Austro-Hungarian example and the Sylvia example, both are free of contradictions in a way, we cannot really answer the second one. The Sylvia example appears to us as being stupid, invented, artificial, and in a way hard to understand. What does it mean, holy dog? Huh? And the seventh, particularly the seventh reincarnation. So, for most of us, the statement about Sylvia has to be rejected as a total. The fact that Sylvia may have been the seventh reincarnation of the holy dog, or she may not have been the seventh reincarnation of the holy dog, must both be rejected because we cannot answer it because we don't understand it by content. So rationality, on the one hand, is consistency, logical consistency, but on the other hand, which is sometimes forgotten, but it also has a contentful dimension that we must consider in order to talk about rationality and at all. Okay, let's come to social representations. Social representations is a form of everyday knowledge for understanding everyday things, and to participate in a communicative community. In a community that has a discourse, that has an exchange of opinions, that have conversations, etc., etc. So let's discuss a bit social representation theory as an approach to societal psychology. So we already said that everyday knowledge has little to do with strict scientific truth. It has to do a lot with acceptable social evidence. And also, everyday knowledge is very much about communication and is therefore a communicative knowledge. A friend of mine who lived in England did this test with his students 20 or 30 years ago. He asked them, he showed the map, he asked them, can you tell me where is Prague and where is Budapest on this map? If you have as reference points Vienna and Berlin. And regularly the students pointed, I don't have a laser pointer here, pointed to somewhere here. Okay, here is Prague and maybe here is Budapest. This changed after the end of the Soviet Empire. Why did it change? Nowadays, people recognize more or less that Prague is about here, so west of Vienna. And Budapest is east of Vienna, about here. The places changed in our representation of the world, simply because the demarcation line, the so-called Iron Curtain, separated an eastern part of Europe from a western part of Europe. And as Prague and Budapest both belonged to the eastern part of Europe, to two socialist countries, they were placed geographically east of Vienna, which obviously was part of the Western Hemisphere. So the social representation at that time, or let's say the politics at that time, influenced very strongly the geographical representation that we had, and created something like a social representation of the geographical positions of countries and cities and capitals, etc. In the moment that this dissolution, this East-West dichotomy was dissolved after the end of the socialist system and the overtaking the countries with the capitalist system, the representation also changed, of course, because suddenly we were looking not at a part of the East and a part of the West, but at Europe as a whole, where the position of the countries and of the capitals of the countries suddenly changed places according as a relative to the beliefs before. In a way, if you talk about social representations, they are image-like structures. They are something that we imagine about an issue or about an object that looks like an image or a metaphor. But what is a metaphor? We all know quickly to define what a metaphor is. Do you want to give me an example of a metaphor?
Well, it changes how we think of it. Anyway, it can be like a trap. When you compare something to something else,
when you compare
the
something,
takes over.
Yeah.
In a way.
Okay. Like the Greek expression metaphora means phora means to carry something to a different place. So what we carry in a metaphor is the meaning of one field, one object, one thing, onto another one. And Lakoff, a linguist, has defined 3 central defining elements of a metaphor. First, we must know for a metaphor to be a metaphor, what is the target domain? That is the one domain that we want to understand, that is yet to be understood, that is not yet well known, that is abstract and probably unintelligible. For understanding this target domain, we use a source domain, which we call anchoring. We anchor the target domain in the source domain, which is a concrete experiential part of everyday life, something that we have an experience with, where we know our way, for example. And of course, a relation between the two. That's what we need. The relation itself is a kind of, as he calls it, a structural correlation between source and target domain. What this means we'll show immediately. For example, if we say that an atom is a thing, I mean, that's the usual everyday explanation. If somebody has some schooling and physics education, then he or she knows that an atom consists of more or less 2 parts, the central nucleus and electrons that are circulating around the nucleus. It's more or less correct, no? Yeah. So the target domain actually is the atom that we want to understand. In physical terms, it is a more or less a probabilistic quantum field function that describes energy distribution within a certain part of space, of course. And this probabilistic distribution of field force can be shown to be like this. If you look at something like the H orbital psi square, which describes the energy level of different electronic, how shall I say, spheres that form the shape of the atom around the core. And in analogy with the drum, we could say that the energy function oscillates in a certain way. So all this has to do with physics, and few people know about this. So in order to understand this physically quite complex situation, we need something like a source. We need a source domain for everyday, for understanding the target. So we could imagine, for example, some object that is being hurled on a string, a stone or something, or a carousel where the people are being moved around a central core, which gives us a basic structure, the structure of objects revolving around another object, or an object circling a center. And actually, it's a physicist, Niels Bohr, from Denmark, who introduced this metaphorical image of the atom. So it is not an invention out of clear sky that we imagine here in this metaphor. So let's start with the target domain, which is, of course, a probabilistic quantum field function, etc., that describes the structure of an atom. So we take a source domain that we all know about, that we have experienced ourselves, which is part of our experiential world. That's the source. It's concrete, and we know what it is and how it feels. And this gives us the source to understand the target in a way that we take the basic structure of the source, project it onto the target in order to get an image or a feeling or an idea of what an atom may be. That is something that consists also of a core where things rotate about, which we call electrons. And by this kind of metaphorical projection, the target domain becomes also experiential, it becomes concrete, it becomes imaginable, and at the end it becomes part of our everyday world in a way that we can talk about atoms in everyday life without blushing, even though we don't know anything about the physical realities behind, even if we don't know anything about quantum theory. To give you an example that's a little bit closer to your everyday life. This is an advertisement that was in a newspaper where it says, your PC is passionate about Teleweb. Teleweb is a provider for internet. So these look like computer mice, but not really. They have something else. What is it? They look like something that we know from a completely different region or realm. Something that looks like sperms, of course. Why do we immediately understand this advertorial? It builds, this advert builds immediately, or builds very successfully on on the social representation that we maintain about sperm and ovum. A relationship that we learned in school, where the textbooks and the movies that we saw about the relationship between sperm and ova showed us that the sperm are the cells that are moving towards the ovum in a race, so to say, for being the first to arrive at the ovum. So the representation of conception, the representation of the biological cells of sperm and ovum has consequences even for everyday understanding of advertorials, of announcements, of economic, of commercial propaganda. So in a way, we need to understand what is the social representation of sperm and ovum, and what is the metaphorical format or shape that this representation takes. Let's come to modern schooling. In contrast to bad schooling, to countries or regions where there is not a good school system, modern school children know that there are two parts involved in conception, that is the sperm and the ovum, two cells that interact in a way. And we know this since 200 or 300 years, since Leeuwenhoek discovered that there are two entities involved in fecundization. So the basic structure of the target domain of the metaphor is how to understand the interaction between two biological cells. No? The task is how to understand the conception in terms of a metaphor or icon. So what is a suitable source domain for understanding sperm and ovum? Well, what we discovered was that the most suitable source domain that people considered appropriate and functional was the mutual behavior of men and women in sexual interaction. So what they preferred very much to use as a target domain of the behavior of sperm and ovum in the metaphor of conception is when the man takes the active role and the woman the more passive role. And to project this image onto the biological cells. But of course, there is another possibility. We can imagine the woman, the female part, taking the activity, and the man being the passive part. This would be a metaphor where the ovum takes the active role. So we presented these different possibilities of a metaphor to our subjects, telling them, Do you think that the interaction between sperm and ovum is very much like a man searching contact with a woman? Or is it more like a woman trying to catch a man? And we gave them additional possibilities, additional source domains for a metaphor to consider, for example, non-social domains. Because there are other things that come together in the non-social field, in the non-social environment. That is, for example, a mosquito biting a person. That's also a kind of relationship that could be used to describe the relationship between sperm and ovum, where, in this case, the active sperm, or the sperm would take the active role. Again, we can picture this whole non-social target domain in the other way around, making the ovum the active part, in telling or giving them the option, the subjects the option to say whether sperm and ovum relate to each other like a mosquito biting a victim, or with the sperm taking the active part, or like a cat chasing a mouse, where the ovum takes the active part. So it's quite arbitrary what we can use as as a source domain to describe the target domain, that is the biological interaction between sperm and ovum. And you can guess it, of course. The big preference for our subjects was the social and the sexual source domain, where sperm and ova were compared to men, respectively women, and their everyday interactions. But there was a funny statistical interaction. Liberals, or sex role conservative people, differed in the strength of their beliefs, in the strength of how they thought that these metaphors were plausible. And you can see that the sex role conservative parts of our subjects subscribed much more strongly to an active role of the sperm in conception. And particularly when it is embedded in a social source domain. No surprise to you, I know, because all of you think like that. But is there any reason to consider the sperm as being the active part in conception? I don't think it is. Particularly when we consider the medical and physiological facts. What's going on in the biological process of conception. Why does the sperm to be the active part? In fact, what would we consider this anecdote, for example? A mother is standing on a playground. The little child is in another corner. And the mother says, "Hello, Johnny, come here." And the little boy gets up and runs to the mother. Does the little boy have the active role? No, not really. The mother is the active one. And she exerts a speech act in calling the boy. And he comes. So activity and influence in a situation is not really dependent on movement. And in fact, if we look at the movement of the sperms in the sexual tracts of the man, of the woman, we see that the sperms mostly are transported by the cilia within this physiological part of the procreational tract of the woman. And the orientation of the sperms is not so much driven by the tail movement, which would be completely erroneous if there were not a kind of chemical tracing the way to the ovum, showing the sperms the way to the ovum. Otherwise, they would just run around in any direction. So there is no reason to consider sperms as active. There is no reason to consider ovum as active. It's the same thing. Biological cells are biological cells. Nevertheless, the metaphor that we all possess brings our subjects to subscribe, particularly when we are conservative, to an active role of the sperm. In subscribing to the sex role metaphor of sperm and ovum, meaning that the education that we got in our schools really has an influence on the strength of the metaphors and of the images that we apply in everyday life, still nowadays. And you are not surprised about this metaphor because you all maintain it. My students were not surprised by this metaphor because they just believed it. No, it was part of their life world. But what you probably did not know is that usually we project also other attributes, what we call metaphorical entailment, onto biological cells. Because we asked the subjects, besides the activity and the preference for certain metaphors, we asked them also of how hard or soft do you consider sperm and ovum? How strong or weak do you consider sperm and ovum? And how dominant or submissive, among a whole list of adjectives. And what we see here is that sperms are considered harder than ova. That, okay, strength is approximately the same for both, but this is more important. Dominance. People have no problem to project a concept like dominance and submission onto biological cells, even though the concept of dominance and submission is a concept that applies only in social life. It is a moral concept. No, it has to do with interpersonal relationships in social life, with hierarchy, etc. But subjects, and we all implicitly have no problem attributing only terms and concepts that have validity only in a social environment to a biological process. So in a way, and again we see that sex role conservatives are stronger in these effects than sex role liberals, which shows also the influence of ideology onto our judgments and to beliefs, our beliefs in metaphors. So what's actually happening here in this metaphor is that the natural process, the biological process of conception, the meeting of sperm and ovum, is being socialized. That we are using or subscribing to a metaphor that is actually socializing the natural by projecting attributes, stereotypical attributes of the female and stereotypical attributes of the male side onto their biological products, which is how metaphors work. Okay? The media that are responsible for this are the school textbooks, school teaching, and the films, for example, that always show just the moving sperm. They don't show the underlying physiological structure. And that's this deep-seated metaphor that we maintain about conception is responsible for us to understand advertisements like this and many others. There are hundreds of this, using this metaphor that we all subscribe to in order to promote certain products. Okay? This propaganda, commercial propaganda, would not work if we, not all of us, would subscribe to this kind of thinking. So, what kind of images or metaphors will become widely accepted? Widely accepted will be those that are first compatible with our local culture, because the images provided by our culture is the source, more or weniger the big set of sources that we can use in metaphorical understanding. That will be those, of course, that capture the core of a target domain, of a target idea. And that is, of course, also appealing to the imaginary world of the majority. So just to repeat this one sentence, because it's important. An image or metaphor is not true, correct, or accurate, but it is good to think. It's good to think. That's a good metaphor. It's not true, it's not correct, it's not scientific. It's good to think, it's good to communicate, and it's good to use for understanding conversations, discourses, and media reports. So in a way, social representations and the structure of social representations as images or as metaphors are an issue of taste and of aesthetics, much more than an issue of scientific truth. Okay? So much to social representation theory, and just to summarize a bit. As I tried to show, social representations involve an individual level and a collective level. On the individual level, we can consider a social representation a knowledge structure about an issue or an object or something else that is socially shared, that we share with others, because that's the prerequisite for communication, of course. Think of the holy dog. If nobody of us has an idea of an holy dog, and it's reborn, it's being reborn, we cannot communicate about it. We must be clear about the evidence that is acceptable in our culture in order to talk about social representation. It's necessary for communication and understanding, of course, and it takes the shape of an everyday theory. An everyday theory that sometimes may look like a metaphor. And the other thing is, it can be expressed on many different levels. It can be expressed in our behaviors. For example, the representation of a university is expressed in your behavior of how you populate the seats here. It can be discursive. It can be patterns of interaction between people, etc., etc. And of course, once it is being reified, and we will come back to this next time, once it is being reified, it will be expressed in terms of institutions. Institutions bring us to the collective level of social representations. Because social representations and the coming about of a social representation, as it involves a discursive event and as it involves media activity, is a way of, or is a part of social construction, a term that is used so very often, and we will try to concretize this term next time. It can also be called, the collective process can be called collective symbolic coping, a process that we discussed in the seminar today at lunchtime. Collective symbolic coping, where the media and public discourse try to make something novel, intelligible, and communicable through the activities of reporting about something and of having people talking about it. And the making of social representation involves two processes. One is the anchoring, that is to establish a reference to a pre-existing knowledge, which is more or less the source target of a metaphor, to categorize the novel in terms of the old categories, to use the source domain in order to understand and categorize the new, and of unintendedly transferring some attributes of the old to the novel. like the metaphorical entailment. You remember calling biological cells dominant or submissive is extremely stupid. I mean, it doesn't have any justification. Still, we think in those terms. And in contrast to anchoring, which is the first part of the process, we can talk about objectification also, which is later in the development of a social representation. This requires that a collectivity already agreed more or less on a way of talking about something, and they reify it or they objectify it as a valid metaphor, a valid image that we can use to communicate. For example, the deeply ingrained image that you have of the interaction between sperm and ova. Okay? In objectification, something abstract becomes very concrete, it becomes touchable and remains and gets a completely new character that it did not have before. Okay? So, in summarizing everything, social representations have an image metaphorical structure that we are not necessarily aware of. That is, we don't know, we are not always aware of what we believe, the images that come to our mind. We are not aware of this image of conception that we have in our minds, even though we apply it to understanding advertisements. That helps us to understand spontaneously things that appear in our social world and social representations that have the function of helping in communication. So if we look at the process scheme, where I must admit that it doesn't quite work in my arrangement here. But anyway, we have a group, okay? This group maintains certain beliefs, the different shapes in the blue square. This group encounters something new, like, lightning, something that ruptures our world, something that may threaten our way of living. And this new thing will stimulate the media activity and some collective symbolic coping in the way of a discourse, of a collective discourse. And this collective discourse has at the beginning, of course, the anchoring processes, as I mentioned, the search for a source domain, and the process of objectifying what has been discussed and discoursed about in the collective elaboration of this object. This objectification will result in a new social representation that by itself becomes part of the life world of the group. So that was it for today. Thank you. If there are questions and doubts and everything, I think we should all listen to it if you have something to the...
About the exam.
Yes, the exam is interesting for everybody also, I think. Okay, what do you want to know about the exam?
When is it?
It will be after the last lecture. In the middle of November is the last lecture. So in the week afterwards, we will have the exam.
And it's based on what you...
It's based on this and, if possible, also based on the basic literature that I mentioned in the curriculum, okay? And that we still put on the website. I will put all these things on the website. Was it on Moodle or on Study Information System? Okay.